John, in a historical context, how did work choices change or challenge Australia's workplace culture?
To understand the impact of work choices, you've got to put in the context of the evolution of labour standards. Up until the 19th century, rights at work were determined by the criminal law and the commercial law, and unions basically didn't get a look in. If you tried to organise a union, you were locked up for a conspiracy in restraint of trade, and that was both a criminal and civil offence. Over time, labour law evolved to give people the right to get together and the right for industrial tribunals to set labour standards. Now, what Work Choices did is that it reversed an evolution that had been going on for about 150 years, where the rights of workers under labour law had been slowly increasing. What Work Choices did is it shrunk the reach of labour law by saying you've only got these 5 minimum standards. It then centralised the process by which those standards were set and gave that primarily to the minister. And finally, it turned the machinery of setting labour standards away from that task and focused it tightly on unions. So instead of industrial tribunals being about protecting rights at work, it became about harassing unions. So in a nutshell, what Work Choices did is it shrunk labour law, centralised it and empowered employers.
And how did this change the wider culture of Australia? Did it change some of Australia's fundamental, or challenge some of Australia's fundamental values and beliefs?
I think you've always got to recognise Australian society's been a pluralistic society. There's been many different currents running through it. There has, at a number of times in our past, been a very aggressive employer culture where they have wanted to impose individual contracts, and the big disputes in the 1890s were about the right to contract. That's what those big disputes were about. So there's always been an element of this employer obsession with control and fracturing bargaining units, but it's, if you like, been kept under wraps for about the best part of 100 years. And what John Howard did is mobilise that current within the employer community and said, have a free hand. So that, if you like, regressive tendency in the employer community had been held in check by many other employers who believed in a fair go, believed in sharing the gains, believed in cooperation and negotiation. And Work Choices cut right across that. Any employer who started to talk to unions was regarded as a wimp and somebody who was a threat to the employer community. And it was this kind of divisive view of Australian society that I think was the most important legacy of the intervention.
And what about the impact on people who were basically employees, just going about their work, living their lives? How did it change Australia in that way?
Well, I think it's important to take a kind of total labour market perspective here, because the labour market is very much like the Paul Robeson song Old Man River. You know, he just keeps rolling along, and the labour market did just kind of keep rolling along when Work Choices were there. But where there was change, where people changed their jobs or agreements came up for renewal, there was sharp and stark change. For the great bulk of the workforce, there wasn't much of a change. But where they moved to a new employer or they had to settle a new agreement, then they found themselves bargaining in an environment with very few rights and with the option for the employer to really go after them if they didn't like what was happening. So we looked at agreements in the retail and hospitality sectors, and the changes there were stark. You had award protections for people who worked antisocial hours on the weekend or after at the evenings, and they had all those rights stripped out. Now, that wasn't every worker in retail and hospitality lost those rights, but for those ones who were subject to an agreement or a non-union agreement coming up for renewal, or they changed jobs where an employer put those agreements on them, that was a very sharp change. And that's an erosion of standards that happened far faster here because of Work Choices than in New Zealand, because in New Zealand all they did was basically tear the awards up and said, go and negotiate. Here in Australia, Work Choices sent the signal, this is what you can get away with, and all the rogue employers in the labour market said that's exactly what we'll take, and that's what happened.
And if John Howard had been re-elected and Work Choices had endured, what sort of country would Australia be now and be heading towards?
I think you would find the labour movement was highly demoralised. You would find that employers would be even more emboldened than they were with an economic downturn. Unions would have been blamed for it. We would have seen what's been happening in the construction industry, generalised to the entire union movement. So we would have had specialised task forces to seek out and destroy any bastions of union organisation left. And John Howard's made very clear how he would have responded to the global financial crisis. For him, unemployment is as a function of high taxes and high minimum wages and unfair dismissal rights. So he would have wound back unfair dismissal rights, lowered taxes, especially for the rich, and then done something about really putting the heat on the Fair Pay Commission to try and even lower standards further than they've gone already.
So what do you think motivated John Howard to introduce Workchoices? Was it a long-held ideological quest, a visceral dislike of unions, just personal baggage? What was it?
Look, I don't claim to have a privileged insight into John Howard's mind. I can only think that there is a deep dislike within John Howard and the political strain of which he's a part that just doesn't like autonomous forms of collective organisation in civil society. They just don't like the fact that people can get together and stand up to authority. And I think there's also a big P political story here. If you break the back of the union movements, you break the back of Labor parties, and I think he was aiming for a king hit. He'd won an election which everyone said he probably shouldn't have won, and he thought, well, I can do anything, so I'm going to change the political landscape. So I think there's two issues there: a deep philosophical, I think, belief. I think he genuinely believed that. But there was also, I think, a larger, grander political vision to try and change the political landscape.
So he had that grand vision and he took a big gamble.
Look, I mean, for all John Howard's faults, he was a guy with clear ideas and a lot of capability in getting those ideas put into action. So you might not like the content of what he did, but he was actually a very effective politician in offering a lead and then delivering.
Didn't pay off.
We're still fighting on the terrain he structured, and I think it would be a mistake to write him off as a loser. I mean, in many ways, he's changed the way in which we define these issues, and the challenge is to break out of that kind of intellectual vice.
Just going to that, do you think Workchoices is dead and gone, or do we need to be wary that it may re-emerge? Has it actually disappeared completely?
No, I think to think about Workchoices, you've got to return to that notion that I mentioned earlier. What did it do? It shrunk the reach of labour law, it centralised power, particularly in the minister, and it empowered employers by weakening unions. Now, the Fair Work Act winds back some of that. So the reach of labour law has been extended a little bit, but not anywhere back to where it was after the social welfare workers case in the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, any matter was regarded as an industrial matter and could be put in an agreement or put in an award. That's all been shrunk. We still have this concept of matters pertaining, and that is puts a real constraint on what unions can put into enforceable agreements. The centralisation of IR is still there. Admittedly, the discretionary power of the minister is not as great as it was, but we're going for one unified national system, which will weaken the side of states as a potential source of innovation. But I think the most significant change of Fair Work Australia is that there has been a winding back of the deep anti-union principles inscribed in the law, and instead we have far greater balance, so that the labour laws help redress the inequality bargaining power, they don't deepen it.
Can we honestly say that collective bargaining has been put back at the centre?
There's absolutely no doubt that the notion of collective bargaining is important, but let's be clear about that. It's not collective bargaining as thought about in most West European countries. It's enterprise bargaining, it's not multi-employer collective bargaining, and this is very much an employer agenda. The Bureau of Statistics doesn't use the concept enterprise, it uses the concept management unit. And if you actually call this management unit bargaining, you've got a lot clearer idea of what's happening. Our labour law is structured around the sites that management creates, not the ways in which workers think about their jobs.